scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Peppa's house, or so it seemed. The sun was shining through the green walls of the living room, casting familiar shadows across the orange sofa. Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When Peppa went downstairs for breakfast, she found her family sitting around the kitchen table in complete silence. Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and little George were all there, but their eyes were staring straight ahead, unblinking. Their smiles were frozen in place, too wide, too perfect. Peppa called out to them, but they didn't respond. They just kept staring with those unnaturally bright eyes. The television in the living room flickered on by itself, showing static that slowly formed into shapes. Peppa could see herself on the screen, but this version was different. Her reflection moved independently, waving at her with movements that didn't match her own. The reflection's smile grew wider and wider until it stretched beyond what should be possible. Peppa tried to turn off the television, but the remote wouldn't work. Every channel showed the same thing, her own face, but wrong somehow. The reflection began to speak, but the words came out backwards, like a recording played in reverse. The sound filled the entire house, echoing from every room. When Peppa looked back at her family, they had all turned to face her. Their frozen smiles were still there, but now their heads moved in perfect unison, following her every step. George's favorite dinosaur toy sat on the table, but its plastic eyes seemed to blink when no one was looking directly at it. Peppa ran upstairs to her bedroom, hoping to escape the strange atmosphere. But when she looked in her bedroom mirror, she saw the same wrong reflection from the television. This other Peppa pressed her hands against the glass from the inside, as if trying to break through. The real Peppa stepped closer, and their hands almost touched through the mirror's surface. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The house felt normal again. Peppa could hear her family laughing downstairs, calling her name for breakfast. But when she looked in the mirror one last time, she saw her reflection wink at her with one eye, while she herself had not moved at all. As Peppa walked back downstairs, she wondered if she was really the one walking, or if she was the one trapped behind the glass, watching someone else live her life. The laughter from the kitchen sounded just a little too perfect, just a little too bright, like everything else in this house that felt almost, but not quite, like home.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom. The familiar purple bunk bed stood against the blue wall, decorated with their favorite drawings. Everything seemed normal until Peppa noticed something strange about their toys. The teddy bear was now facing the wall, and the toy train had moved from its usual spot. George pointed at his dinosaur toy, but when Peppa looked closer, she saw that its plastic eyes had turned completely black. The cheerful green dinosaur now had an unsettling grin that seemed to follow their every movement. The room temperature dropped suddenly, and their breath became visible in the cold air. Mummy Pig called from downstairs, but her voice sounded different, deeper and echoing strangely. When Peppa tried to respond, no sound came from her mouth. George tugged at her red dress, his happy expression replaced by confusion and fear. The drawings on their wall began to change, innocent pictures transforming into dark, twisted shapes. The bedroom door slowly creaked shut on its own. The yellow lamp above flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows. Peppa grabbed George's hand as they heard footsteps in the hallway, but they were too heavy to belong to Mummy or Daddy Pig. The footsteps stopped outside their door. The doorknob began to turn slowly, making a grinding sound. Peppa and George huddled together on the bottom bunk, watching as the door opened to reveal a figure that looked like Daddy Pig. But something was terribly wrong. His glasses reflected no light, and his usual smile had been replaced by an expression they had never seen. This Daddy Pig moved differently, his movements jerky and unnatural. When he spoke, his voice came from somewhere else in the room. He told them it was time for a special game. They had to stay perfectly still until morning, no matter what they saw or heard. As the night progressed, more family members appeared. Mummy Pig arrived, but her orange dress was now faded gray. Grandpa and Grandma Pig joined them, standing motionless in the hallway like silent guardians of some ancient secret. The house itself seemed to be changing. The familiar yellow walls stretched higher than before, and new doors appeared where there had been none. Strange sounds echoed from rooms that shouldn't exist, children playing games that had no names, and laughter that belonged to no one they knew. Peppa realized that their real family was somewhere else, and these figures were something that had taken their place. The morning sun never came, and time seemed to move in circles. Every time they thought dawn was approaching, the darkness would return, deeper than before. The last thing Peppa remembered was the sound of her own voice, but it was coming from one of the figures in the hallway, speaking words she had never said, telling a story about two little pigs who had learned to play the most wonderful game, the game of becoming someone else entirely. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa and her family were visiting Grandpa Pig's farm for what seemed like a normal weekend. But when they arrived, something felt different. The farm was too quiet, and the animals were nowhere to be seen. Grandpa Pig greeted them with his usual smile, but his eyes seemed darker than usual, almost hollow. As night fell, Peppa noticed strange sounds coming from the barn. She decided to investigate, despite Mummy Pig's warnings to stay inside. The barn door creaked open, revealing rows of empty animal pens. But in the shadows, Peppa could see glowing eyes watching her. The next morning, George was missing. Daddy Pig searched everywhere while Mummy Pig grew increasingly worried. Grandpa Pig suggested they check the old well behind the farmhouse. When they peered down, they heard George's voice echoing from the depths, but it sounded different, distorted. Peppa volunteered to go down and rescue her brother. As she descended on a rope, the walls of the well began to change. They weren't made of stone anymore, but seemed to pulse like living tissue. The deeper she went, the more the walls whispered her name. At the bottom, she found George, but he wasn't alone. There were other children there, all from the village, all with the same hollow eyes as Grandpa Pig. They spoke in unison, telling Peppa that she was now part of the farm's collection. George turned to face her, and his familiar smile had been replaced by something else entirely. He explained that Grandpa Pig had been collecting children for years, keeping them in the underground chambers beneath the farm. They would never grow old, never leave, and never be found. Peppa tried to climb back up, but the rope had disappeared. The walls began closing in, and she could hear Grandpa Pig's laughter echoing from above. The other children surrounded her, welcoming her to their eternal family. As the walls pressed closer, Peppa realized that the farm had always been a trap. Every visit, every happy memory, had been leading to this moment. The animals hadn't disappeared. They had been replaced by the children who came before her. In the final moments, as darkness consumed everything, Peppa heard Mummy and Daddy Pig calling her name from far above. But their voices were already fading, becoming part of the whispers in the walls. Soon they too would join the collection. The farm fell silent once again, waiting patiently for the next family to visit. Grandpa Pig returned to his house, his smile as warm and welcoming as ever, ready to greet the next unsuspecting visitors who would come looking for a peaceful weekend in the countryside. A scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The familiar yellow walls seemed darker somehow, and the cheerful pictures on the wall appeared to be watching her with their painted eyes. Peppa rubbed her eyes and looked again, but everything seemed normal now. Downstairs, Mummy and Daddy Pig were having breakfast as usual, but they weren't talking. They sat in complete silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead, chewing their food with mechanical precision. When Peppa said good morning, they turned their heads toward her in perfect unison, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. George was playing with his toy dinosaur in the corner, but the toy wasn't making its usual roaring sounds. Instead, it seemed to whisper something that Peppa couldn't quite understand. When she moved closer to listen, George looked up at her with eyes that weren't quite his own. They were darker, older, as if something else was looking out from behind them. The telephone rang, and Mummy Pig answered it with that same unnaturally wide smile. She spoke in a voice that sounded like hers, but felt wrong, agreeing to meet someone at the playground. As they prepared to leave the house, Peppa noticed that all the clocks had stopped at exactly 12 minutes past 3. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were already there, standing in a perfect circle around the slide. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, and all the others stood motionless, their heads tilted at the same angle, their smiles identical. They began to speak in unison, their voices creating a strange harmony that made Peppa's ears ring. The playground equipment began to move on its own. The swings swayed back and forth with no one on them, the seesaw rocked up and down in a steady rhythm, and the roundabout spun slowly, creaking with each turn. The children continued to stand in their circle, their eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if she was moving through thick mud. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, all perfectly synchronized, following her at the same steady pace. No matter how hard she tried to run faster, the footsteps stayed exactly the same distance behind her. She found herself back at home, but it wasn't quite right. The yellow house was now a pale gray color, and the windows were all dark, even though she could see lights moving inside them. The front door opened before she could reach it, and Daddy Pig stood there with his arms outstretched, welcoming her home with that same too-wide smile. Inside, the family sat around the dinner table, but there was no food. They all stared at Peppa as she entered, their heads turning to follow her movement. The silence was broken only by the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking much too loudly. As night fell, Peppa lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the house, but instead of the familiar creaks, she heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. The voices were soft and constant, speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt she should. By the end of the week, Peppa stood with her family and friends in the same perfect formation, her head tilted at the same angle as theirs, her smile identical to all the others. The whispers had become a comforting lullaby, and everything was exactly as it should be.
Peppa Pig, the smiling one. It all started one evening, when the whole family was sitting in the living room. Daddy Pig was telling funny stories, George was giggling, and Mummy Pig was quietly smiling. Peppa laughed, loudly, sincerely, brightly, and then something else laughed too. Ha, ha, ha! It wasn't an echo, it was too slow, as if someone repeated her laugh, but not right away. Then again, ha, ha, ha! Peppa froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "What, darling?" said Mummy Pig. "Someone laughed with me, but weirdly." "Probably the TV." Daddy Pig waved it off, but the TV was off. That night, Peppa woke up from silence. George was breathing softly, the house didn't creak. Everything was still. And then, ha, ha, ha. Now it came from outside the window. Peppa stepped up to the glass. Behind it, a figure, tall, thin, too thin. Its head was long, snout narrow, mouth stretched into a wide smile, like it was cut open. No teeth, eyes, hollow, black, empty. It didn't move, it just watched. Then it said, "Peppa," in her voice, but delayed, as if it had heard it earlier and was now repeating it. Peppa jumped back, pulled the curtains shut, and hid under her blanket. In the morning, she told no one, but at breakfast, George giggled again, and from outside the window came, he, the same voice, only closer. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to George. "What?" "It laughs. When we laugh." Later that day, Peppa went to Mummy Pig. "Who is he?" Mummy Pig looked at the window. "If you've seen him already, then he's close. He comes when someone laughs. He hears us through the laughter." "What does he want?" Mummy didn't answer. That night, Peppa woke up again. Everything was quiet, but on the window, a message, from the inside, as if drawn by a foggy hoof. "I like how you laugh." Below it, scratches, 5 long ones. The family photo on the wall had changed. Everyone smiled. But Peppa, her smile was different, a little wider, too symmetrical, and her eyes seemed hollow. In the evening, she heard him again, first at the window, then in the hallway, then right outside her bedroom door. He was repeating her words. Don't look, don't look. But she hadn't said that out loud, only thought it. In the mirror, he was there, standing behind her, smiling, long, without eyes, only a mouth. When Peppa turned, no one. I am you, he whispered, just with the smile turned inside out. Since then, Peppa doesn't laugh, and she doesn't let George laugh either, because with every laugh, he gets closer, and one day, he'll smile with her face. Peppa Pig, tap, tap, tap. It started with a faint sound. One night, Peppa woke up to a soft tap, tap, tap. She sat up on her pillow, listened. Silence. Wind outside, rustling trees. Nothing strange. But as soon as she lay back down, tap, tap, tap. 3 short knocks, steady, as if someone tapped on the window. Probably my imagination, she whispered to herself. She forgot about it the next morning. The day went on as usual. George played, the parents laughed, everything felt calm. But at night, it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Exactly at 2:13 a.m. On the third night, Peppa couldn't resist. She walked to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing, no one, just the garden, swallowed in fog. She turned away and noticed, on the inside of the glass, hoof prints, as if someone had tapped from within. George? She whispered, but George was fast asleep. She checked. He hadn't moved. On the 4th night, Peppa stayed awake. Wrapped in a blanket, she sat watching the window. 2:13 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart clenched. She crawled closer, and for just a moment, it looked like someone was in the window's reflection. A figure, tall, thin, standing right behind the glass. But outside, there was no one. She shut the curtain and hid under the blanket. Didn't sleep until morning. In the daylight, everything seemed normal again. The marks on the glass had vanished. No one believed her. Daddy Pig said, "Just a draft." Mummy Pig smiled. Maybe it was a dream? Even George only shrugged. On the 5th night, she decided to write everything down. She opened a notebook, sat on the bed. 2:13 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. She jumped up and pulled open the curtain. Nothing, but in the reflection, her room, and another Peppa inside, standing by the bed, staring straight at the window. Was that the real one? Was she outside or inside? For a second, she didn't know who was who. She shut her eyes, counted to 10, opened them. The room was the same, but the glass, there was a word on it. "Let me in," drawn with a finger, from inside, on the misty glass. Peppa screamed and ran to her parents' room, but it was empty. No one. The beds weren't even made, as if no one had ever slept there. The hallway, dark, from her room, light, and a shadow approaching the window. Peppa stepped back, then heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Not on the window now, on her bedroom door, and a voice, just like hers. "Peppa, you promised to let me in."